And we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another webinar that I was waiting for to have this conversation since so long, because with Charles, we've been discussing in privately in dark rooms about these problems, and then we said we actually need to bring all this conversation to the world because it's such an important topic. But before we dive in this super exciting crossover between GRC engineering and security, Charles, do you want to tell a little bit for the few people and the few unlucky folks that don't know who you are, what you do, and why you bring such joy in GRC and engineering, and a smile to my face?
Well, thank you for the warm words and kind introduction there. For folks that may not know me, my name is Charles Nwatu. I have the privilege of working at Netflix, doing some great work around GRC and enterprise continuity, and really trying to find a balance there. My background is not really a GRC focus. I actually came from an incident response, malware, reverse engineering background. So the trajectory of my career to land in a space within GRC and really looking at it from the lens of, like, how can we do this better? The old question around what's the value of compliance and continuity and risk work to not just the business, but to the security teams, and how do we actually make that tangible for folks to do? So that's really what gets me up and going. And to your point, Francesco, like the smile, that's the energy that enthuses me when it comes to talking about this domain space, because I truly see the value and impact of what it can provide.
I agree, and I'd have to say, from a personal perspective, I haven't. It's rare to find few folks that talks with the same passion about a specific topic, and you know how I get evaporated about connecting the two words together and trying to make a difference. Because right now, I think we're suffering from alert fatigue. We're suffering from everything is panic mode, and especially in the last, I don't know, 2 years specifically, we've been suffering from, I think, alert fatigues, where the word critical of a problem, of a risk, or something like that has been a little bit overused. I mean, on the other side, we had a lot of very special events, I think, in the last 3 years, together with COVID, that has added that level of stress. But from your perspective, what do you think? Have you seen your world and the rest of the industry changing in these last, I don't know, 3-4 years, and how you seen the world changing?
Yeah. Well, currently, I think there are a lot of economic headwinds that are causing security teams, just in general, I think, to just understand, okay, how do I focus and prioritize on the right things for not just the security, but also enabling the business to reach their objectives? And what are some of the mechanisms and frameworks and tools to do that? I would hypothesize and say that most security organizations have your traditional AppSec, product security, cloud infrastructure, SOC, some flavor of GRC. So there's really consistent themes that you see. The real question is, well, how do these functions support and facilitate the appropriate dialogue and risk management for their domain spaces, and ultimately helping the business achieve their desired outcomes? So I think from that perspective, I see an intentional effort to figure out an answer to the following question: what should I work on, and why am I working on it? Not just from a security perspective, but also the engineers and the business, for when security teams ask of something of the business, and also their engineers.
And I like that aspect, but I think what I should work on from one word and the other words, from a business perspective, from a engineer perspective, and from a security perspective, and from a risk and compliance perspective, can have very, very widely different answer, right?
Agree.
How do we amalgamate? How do we amalgamate those words? I think that's what I would like to get to the good folks that are listening to us today. Kind of strategy and technique, how we can talk with context to the various teams, because as you're well aware, and you've seen all these words kind of changing and moving yourself into various organizations, into various roles, you've seen those words have different contexts, and I've seen it myself. how can we talk with security engineers and business and connect those, even these two simple words that should be connected together?
Yeah, it's very interesting because as you and I have talked about offline, like this concept of like the shift left movement that happened within the security domain space, whether you want to call it DevOps, security DevOps, DevSecOps, whatever you want, but the takeaway basically,
every permutation
every
possible.
pairing, yeah, exactly. The main takeaway that I observed was that security was being brought into the development cycle, at least from the engineering standpoint. And security felt as if they were already far away from potentially like the engineering needs and speed of the business. And as I was thinking about that, I said, well, GRC is traditionally behind security. So if security is being pulled in through the speed and rapidness of what the DevOps constructs provides, that means GRC, even from a program and archetype, is very different. That means it's all the way still on the right. And how do we find the pathways that enable the speed, the movement to, if not catch up as partners, but in some cases get ahead with regards to the security and engineering aspect? And then you flip that to the business, to your point, that the business has an idea of where they want to get to, and are there any regulatory compliance obligations for which we need the engineering and security teams to help achieve? So if the shift left movement has left GRC a little bit behind, the variance and speed of catching up for GRC is, to me, different than the speed and complexity that I would say like a traditional security engineering organization operates, because of the archetypes that make up the teams. And I think that's an area where I'm looking to, I think this topic sort of came up around, okay, well, how do we bridge the world of GRC and engineering, and to bring in the elements and principles of engineering so that GRC data can be available in infrastructure and systems in a way that teams can actually use that to at least inform decision-making, or at a minimum, just reduce their uncertainty about things.
I think you touch on a very important topic, that is context, but also prioritizing and focusing on a finite number of things. And those are very different from a GRC perspective and an engineering perspective. And as you said, mentioning also from a business perspective, like business like to operate with risk. Engineers like to work on number of critical vulnerabilities or number of things fixed. And the two words kind of don't collide. And then you cross over with GRC that says you have this control, you have this set of things that are ephemeral in nature or broad spectrum, and they don't really translate if you're building an application. How does compliance with data regulation maps into specific feature requests that you need to build, right? How can we, well, first of all, how we can create more empathy? Because I think what I've seen is the work colliding together and saying everybody saying, I have the higher ground, I'm right, or this needs to be done so, and hence fix the ticket, fix the 2000 Jira ticket that you have in there, or comply with this regulation, period, without giving actionable insight to engineers.
Yeah, very great question there. Part of that, I actually say this in a way of like, technically, I believe we can solve any of the problems that exist. I think the hurdle that gets in our way is the relationship and trust management as to why and how we communicate these findings to individuals, to teams, to the business. I sort of lean on the idea that if we have the appropriate relationships and trust models with these teams, and providing the right context as to why we're doing this work, not just what the work is, like that, to me, technically, we get that. Like, you got to close VPN ports, you got to firewall rules, whatever the case may be. That, to me, that's very tangible, very understandable. But it's like, why am I doing this work? How do I make the relation of what you're asking me in respect to the engineering tasks that I have to do? And then how do those actually compare to what the business is trying to achieve? Because in reality, they should be complementary. Like, my work should be facilitating at some point the growth of the business, or at least risk management at large. Because the other, I guess, behavior that I've seen is that this innate nature from a risk management standpoint of security and engineering to close all the doors. And I'm pushing back and saying, well, do we actually need to close all the doors versus just understanding how the doors function and what they lead to, and better prioritizing which doors to close versus closing all the doors? Like, how do we get into that conversation where we're continuously using the data about our environment to help inform whether it be security and compliance obligations for which the engineers and the rest of the business need to address?
And have you seen regulators? Well, I've seen regulators taking a more technical stance on his CISA, and few other regulators taking more of a technology-based stance rather than purely very fluffy stance. Have you seen the GRC board reacting to that and getting more technical rather than less technical, or even more business focus?
I think it's a blend of both. I am seeing, even on like my LinkedIn feeds, there are individuals that I'm aware of that are pushing some more of that narrative of the um, the expansion of engineering within GRC, the concept of being able to make GRC data available to other systems within engineering to add that additional context. I am seeing that now from a regulator standpoint, in terms of, are you meeting the essence of the requirement versus the data and the evidence you would need to collect? I'm still trying to figure that domain space out, because I would like to challenge that in terms of, okay, are you asking me about the requirement or the impact of what this requirement does within our business? And let me show you how we've approached that and the data that we would collect through our systems that would provide some level of assurance. Because at the end of the day, we're really trying to assure the activities for which we say we do, which is compounded by the governance that you set within the business and organization.
And I think is interesting, because that's a little bit driven by the whole, I think, craze about data lake. That data is data, and we just dump all the data in a single place, and then for the joy of the cloud provider or the data cloud provider, because yay, data billing. But that data has meaning, and the meaning needs to be interpreted. And as you say, it's like, okay, observability, but what do you want me to observe, or what is the question that you want to answer, so that I can observe? Observing everything leads to exhaustion. And as you said, you can provide the data, but what is the question that you want to answer? What are the control that you want to monitor, or what is the question that fundamentally you want answered for?
Yeah, just because you have all the data there doesn't actually provide true value. Like there are different levels of value with having the data, like, as you mentioned, in the data lake. Part of it also is understanding how do you process that data into information and then therefore knowledge. They say knowledge is actionable. So like the data itself is just an organizing function. And as we talked about earlier, the whole shift left initiative, if GRC data is within systems that are, I would say, tough to get out or tough to share, or the UI UX experience. Hey, I'm still in this domain.
The word
I got friends.
The word you're searching is databases behind password when you're lucky, or complicated UX UI, as you were saying, or spreadsheet.
Yes, all those are true. So how do we help that transition? Because we have the data. It's how do you make the data accessible and available in a way that allows for scalability, that allows for the leverage, that allows for the activity of assurance. Like that's really, I think, what we're trying to get at. But part of that, is really challenging the archetypes that we traditionally have within the GRC domain. And what does that look like? What should it be? What should it be? Or the challenging there. So I'm intrigued about those conversations to sort of stress test the regulators when they come in. Because sometimes you don't want to be the first, because with the first, there are additional questions and requirements that, hey, if everyone else is doing it, let me just follow what everyone else is doing, because that's the experience for which they're used or consistent to seeing. If I'm divergent from that experience, then I bring upon potentially additional scrutiny around, well, we've never seen it done this way. And like, okay, maybe there's an opportunity there to do the education component, to say, hey, is it the requirement or the assurance of what that requirement provides us? And this is how we do it from a process, technology, people component. So that's where I'm still trying to test out and see what does that look like, or what should that experience be.
But and I like really what you say, that is pioneering something new is challenging, and there is a comfort blanket of a spreadsheet or a comfort blanket of doing things. I think the spreadsheet had the comfort blanket of security overall. But there is also risk reward perspective in that aspect. When the amount of tasks that you have to reach, I don't know, let's take PCI DSS. Let's say it's everything CVSS 4 and up needs to be resolved. Now, if you want to follow that point to the letter, you get tons of things to fix, and you spend a lot of effort, money, and time to actually get that things done. Now, maybe you can be a bit more crafty about it, and maybe limiting the scope, or maybe crafting CVSS into risk mitigation and compensating control. That requires effort, but the reward that you get on the back of it, with a regulator and having a risk-based discussion, I think no regulator will ever push back on, yes, I have this bunch of vulnerability, but I have this other much of compensating control and these process and procedures that enable me to react when there is a threat. So that's a new stance. That's a challenging stance backed by data, and that reduce your number of problems that you need to fix. But that's engineering. Like that's trying new things to actually bring this word together. And that's why I like the word GRC engineering, because it's like bringing a new approach to something that is very traditional, and as you said, was kind of left behind in the whole shift left approach.
Yeah,
As security folk.
Yeah, to your point, I like the the fact that you use the word "and," because I don't see it as an "or." It's in addition to. There's a component of time where we're going to need both "and." We need the spreadsheets will exist, but the goal is to figure out how to, I think, create a different experience with the data that they have, and from the way I look at it, decentralizing that information into the systems where it makes sense, being closer to the service providers, engineers, users of that data. If we can build that context into the systems and workflows that they're already there, I believe there's just a value add proposition there in terms of efficiency, in terms of minimizing user input for user errors, and really relying on the machines to do what they do best. So I'm trying to push forward and see, okay, what does the business push back against me when I do that?
Well, and you mentioned, I think you mentioned two very important aspects. That is machine readable data and available data, first of all, as spreadsheet and GRC. Those are realm that traditionally hasn't been connected to real-time operational data, and you have two time frame, to say it politely, of information that usually don't clash. So you might have a list of assets that maybe don't exist anymore, or you're trying to do a compliance effort on, I don't know, PCI DSS, on CVSS that are above 4, on container that don't exist anymore. And I think that's why I get excited, and I like when we speak about GRC engineering is how we can create machine readable data and machine readable control so that we can automate a lot of these controls and functionality, but also communicate with the business, because take it or leave it, the business operate with risk as a factor. And I think it has an ear towards the GRC rather than purely engineering, because from good or worse, GRC tend to talk in things that get the business locked or blocked from doing actually business. So there is kind of an ears of, okay, you have regulation, you're in breach of PCI DSS, or you're in breach of this data regulation, or you're in breach of this particular FCA rule. You're not going to be able to trade. You're not going to be able to do certain actions. So there is that level of risk, problem, rewards, that the business is more linked to it. So how can we unite the GRC and engineering together again?
Yeah, one way to look at it, to your point, is the control requirements, how the idea of continuous state understanding or continuous assurance of those controls? And how do we build those signals in a way that we can detect them from like a data collection standpoint, and then process them for findings for the business and or really and the engineers and developers. To your
I
point,
like the end.
it's something that one of my leaders would tell me, like, write the data once and use many. So if we can write this data once in a way that we can have the right data components and data elements, that we can create different reports, different visuals, different findings for different audiences, we are essentially creating like at least a possible unified taxonomy that allows us to reuse that data to fit the needs of whether it's a business user, engineering, security, etc. So my how is really around, okay, like make the data accessible, make it in a format that is actually usable so that we can then visualize it, share it, report it, etc. Right now, I would say the speed will probably tend to lend itself towards like your security engineering and your developer teams. There are solutions and new products coming out in this GRC space, but it's more, what I've noticed is more about the plumbing of systems, connecting like SaaS applications to workflow systems to just make sure you have all the data in one place. I almost look at it as like evidence collection as a service, like those types of models. But they don't.
But those takes a lot of time.
Exactly, and I don't think they actually solve the problem.
That's one of the problem that we have in the whole GRC space. Is like, okay, how do we collect evidence, but then how do we apply that collected evidence to something else, or how can we map cloud controls or cloud asset or cloud state to something that then ultimately translate into risk? Because just collecting evidence doesn't solve part of a problem, but doesn't make the business more or less risky to operate on. It just helps with the auditor that bothers you to actually collect specific things, right?
I agree, and that's why it's like, what's the transition moving from just pure evidence collection to say we collected evidence to how does that evidence actually support either a control state, a risk management posture for the business? And you mentioned earlier being able to articulate that with an auditor, that most auditors might be open to the idea of a risk-based conversation. Well, I want to test that, because to me, like, the risk is, this is what we've identified in our environment. These are the processes, people, tools that we've supported. Now, these things address requirement 10 point whatever and PCI DSS, but for us, we look at it this way. And that's where I'm unsure about, okay, like if you present that to an auditor who has an expectation of an experience based off their conditioning, what does that actually mean from a risk standpoint? From the business, it may make sense, but as you mentioned, we are also in the business of like dealing with regulators. And that's where I tend to say, like, is this an opportunity for us on the GRC side to also educate, and then also bring in our internal auditors as partners to also help educate? Because our internal audit partners, if they act as a true third line of defense, we would want to also communicate and support their needs for data. Once again, write once, use many. So I think there's an opportunity here, but it's connecting the pieces in a way that makes the data turn into information, therefore some type of action of knowledge.
I like bringing in also the internal stakeholder and also the auditor. I think it helps. It helps educating internally before educating externally, because the first audit you go through is internal audit or internal checks, and if you don't have them on board and with you, very unlikely that you'll be able to convince somebody else to not to. But ultimately, a lot of regulation relies, ISO and few other regulatory requirement relies on risk mitigation and applying specific risk workflow to what you're doing. So in theory, I've seen regulator very well more malleable to say, I don't have this, but then I have this compensating control, and my risk posture is this, and I monitor and mitigate. They might give you a non-compliance or a partial compliance, but it's very rare that approach will not fly with a specific regulator or regulatory body. I mean, if they want to be sticking to the law and to a specific spreadsheet procedures, I'm going to slug the spreadsheet again. That's a different story. But I've seen the world changing with an automated data collection, with a more engineering data collection, with more evidence-based information being collected this way, where it's more real time. So maybe is the time of spreadsheets could be over, or could be soon. Never going to be over, but it could be soon reduced.
Yes, I'm with for the let's reduce to as minimal use as possible. And I think, as you mentioned, just the overall conversation, even about the risk and being able to articulate the risk within like the GRC world and how that maps into security, broader engineering in the business, whether you have like an ERM program, enterprise risk management program, where you're looking at it as purely from a cyber business and security technology risk. Let me flip this back to you. Like, what are your thoughts in terms of just the conversation around CRQ, cyber risk quantification, and how that can help it be an enablement for work like GRC engineering and traditional security engineering work?
That's a good question, and I like the reverse. I like the reverse questioning. Let me start with a story, because that's I can bring a lot of data, and I've been talking a lot of data, but I think the stories are very much more relatable. We've been approaching for several years this problem with just pure vulnerability analysis and prioritization based on just volumetrics. And that's the comfort blanket, unfortunately. We have a comfort blanket that is, I have X amount of problems. How much do I need to fix for when and by when? Period. But that's a language that no business understands and no business can relate, because business want to operate, okay, what do I need to be secure? What do I need to do to be secure? And that is not, well, the natural answer is fix everything. As security professional, it's like gonna take us eons and eons to fix everything in a platoon of people. And at that point, anybody from a business perspective don't have data point to react. So we've been facing, especially coming to a problem that was scale on a number of financial institutions, and where we had a bit more perception of risk and risk quantification, we had the chance and the luck to have a bit more forward-looking executive to say, okay, let me try something completely different here, because we have a sheer amount of problems, and we've been trying to solve this problem with just people. And my team was just burning out. So I said, there must be a better way to actually do this than just completely go nuts over a number of problems, right? And I said, let me try to, as a business, to give you the key and to give you a dial to say how much at risk you want to be. So I flipped the problem on their head and saying, don't ask me how to be secure. I'll guide you on how much risk do you want to operate on and at. As a business, you want to say, I want to be super risky, because the risk reward opportunity is I'm not going to be able to go to market with a specific set of features. So I tolerate that risk much more. Or you might be liable of losing a license or shutting down the business if you breach specific customer trust. Not anymore, apparently. But in general, there is a certain level of risk. Sorry, I had to say that with everything that's been happening this week. And I think there is an element in there that I want to touch as well, of cyber resiliency versus not being able to be breached, that we're getting more comfortable with. But in general, I think a number of executives, not everybody, was more in line to say, okay, I like that idea. I like the fact that I can say, this week I want to be more risky, this week I want to be less risky, and having a dial that I can operate. But then the challenge I was facing was, okay, how do we translate that into something tangible for the engineers? How do we translate that into something that is actionable for people that actually need to do the plumbing and actually reduce compensating control, do something with that information? And that's where I think cyber risk quantification came into the picture and prioritization came into the picture, because solving vulnerability as we're solving it today is pure volumetrics. Solving it with concept of risk and quantification enable us, first of all, to translate a very static information that is a number of vuln or a number of risk, call it whatever you want, into something that is, first of all, temporal, that is linked to a particular state of the environment. And those information give you a particular probability of exploitation. And then how crown jewelly you're operating on. So how critical or how important is the data that you're operating on? And I think I made just the word crown jewel.
Hey, I think we all know what that means.
Or the crown jewel where you operate on, or the type of data where you operate on. So that enable fundamentally to translate all of this information into risk and to operate at a different information that is, what do we fix to reduce risk, or to operate at the risk level where my particular boss, my particular business line is comfortable with. And that actually had an impressive flip side. That was, security wasn't anymore the part of the organization that decided what to fix. The business was deciding what to fix by themselves, to deciding I want to be more at risk, I want to be less at risk. And security was operating to help engineering team achieving that objective faster and speeding up the achievement of specific risk targets faster. And that was, I have to say, that was the surprising part that I was hoping for, but I didn't expect to happen myself. I'm a believer, but that was crazy. And yeah, long story short, that's what we ended up doing. But that was the surprising part of like bringing a word that is engineering into risk and quantification that is fairly simple and very straightforward, with no overly complicated scoring and metrics that you can't explain to a business. So making the scoring understandable by a 5 years old, fundamentally, not making it too complicated, and giving fundamentally somebody from a risk and quantification perspective, GRC perspective, or business perspective, a number that they can make a decision. Do we want to be above, below, like basic linear decision? Do we fix it? Do we delay it? Do we risk accept it? Do we do something with this information? Making a decision with simple number. And that, I think that was the ultimate goal that I wanted to, ended up achieving. So I was happy about the result. What do you think about that story?
It's a land that I want to get to. it's a journey for which I believe I'm a passenger already. And what I take away from your narrative and really what I'm thinking about more broadly is this idea of the risk appetite and risk tolerance, and how that relates to the behaviors you would see in an engineering or business. Mm-hmm. If we have the ability to, I want to say, score risk, and we can get into a little bit more about like the mechanics and the psychological elements of scoring risk, but we'll put that to the side for now. But let's say everyone agrees upon the methods and the models being used to score the risk. To your point, simple enough that a 5-year-old could get an understanding. Being able to use that risk score as a way to manage and drive behavior around risk options. And one area where I sort of push back on folks is that while, yes, we want to reduce risk in the business, I'm of the mindset, I just want to understand the portfolio of risk for which I need to manage. And for within that portfolio of risk, what I want to manage, I have the option to exercise different behaviors against that risk, which could be risk reduction, which could be transfer, abatement, and everything else. Like I'm of the mindset that the language is very important here with regards to risk management or risk options, because most of the times I hear, I want to reduce risk. And I'm of the mindset, does it make sense to reduce risk in relation to the opportunity costs and trade-offs from the engineering side to the business side? My initial answer is, I don't know. I'm not saying risk reduction is the like a wrong approach or anything. I'm just unsure of the data that would allow me to make a statement like that. But what I would love is within my risk option, my risk portfolio, understanding the scores and the behaviors of the business, whether it be from the engineering side or from the product side, and being able to have a conversation with those leaders to say, okay, by doing this behavior, we can resolve or reduce or mitigate this risk, but it's going to show up this way from the business side. And as one of my CFOs used to tell me, like, it's the opportunity cost and trade-off. How can I have a consistent conversation with different individuals with different backgrounds about opportunity costs and trade-offs that makes sense because the language and the data around the risk score is understood in a way that when actually have the conversation about the trade-off, not the mechanics or the math or the model behind, is this risk thing right or not? Which is something I said we could talk later, because that's another hurdle to getting to that point. But like I said, I believe I'm on that destination. I am on that journey with you. I just don't know when I'm going to get there.
And on that part, I think you use an analogy that I really like, especially on the risk rewards option. I think the flashlight analogy, where it was shining the light, and I really like that, because when you work with vulnerability and information and scanner in my world, you're looking at a problem with like kind of shielded from everything that is happening. You look at the problem atomically, knee-jerk reaction, what comes to you, you resolve it, and you constantly fighting all of these things that comes at you. But when you can have that contextual aspect, and that's my shining light, where you can see things from a broader perspective, as you said, what do I do with this risk? Do I reduce it? Do I mitigate it? Do I do something? Do I transfer? There are so many more options than just fixing everything, because we are fatigued. But I'll give you back the word, because you say you tell the story much better on that analogy.
So the analogy that Francesco is talking about is like having the ability to mature a risk quantification program is a unique journey in of itself. And there is simple math that can be done that just gives you an understanding around current state. And there's this whole conversation around precision and accuracy that goes into the cyber risk quantification world. Now, in my experience, I found it challenging to meet some engineers where they're at with regards to like, hey, do I believe this data? Do I even believe the models and math that go behind this data? This feels like fuzzy logic, fuzzy math. And I said, we're walking in the dark right now. And I just turned on the flashlight and shined it at our feet and said, like, we at least know we're walking on solid ground. If I just tilt the flashlight a little bit up, I can say, oh, there's a tree over there. We might want to at least avoid that tree. The further I put the flashlight out into the distance, I may not see what's actually there with the amount of accuracy and precision, but I can probably make out the shape of, oh, this looks like it could be a house. Now, I don't know if it's a 2-story, 3-story, 1-story, whatever, but there's a structure that looks like a home or some type of building for which could provide a shelter. And all I'm asking when it comes to the cyber risk folks and the consumers of that risk data is, right now we're operating in a state of uncertainty. All I'm trying to do is help shape that uncertainty that provides us a little bit more confidence that I'm not stepping on your toe, we won't bump into that tree, and if we shelter, there's something over there that looks like a building that we can run to. And using the flashlight as the risk score, the ability to even modify it, we can change the type of light it shines, we can change the amount of watts it produces out. Like, we have the ability to do that. But just being open to the idea that the numbers may challenge how you feel about your domain space. And that feeling, I want to understand why and how it's making you feel. Because going back to earlier, if there's no trust and relationship with the number, it doesn't matter how much I show you about the model, the data points and everything else. You're going to potentially anchor from like a psychological point on, this doesn't feel right, or this feels off, even if the data may make sense. So that's where I get into this interesting experience around like building a cyber risk program, and just the engagements that I have with folks that are engineers and their thought process around, hey, like, is this really real or is this fuzzy math? And I'm just saying, I'm just trying to help reduce your uncertainty about this thing. Because I can tell you right now, we're bumping into trees, I'm stepping on toes, and we can't see any lodging in the distance. I'm just trying to help provide some structure about what could be in front of us. Would you be open to that idea?
Being open to new things is certainly challenging, and the same kind of psychological blockade that I face is I have a feeling that I know something about risk, but then if you show me the math that is something more consistent and systematic, I don't trust the math. Or I feel threatened by the numbers and by the math. And I think we discussed with few risk folks from a financial perspective, and they said from a gut feeling perspective, we've wrong 99.99% of the time. I don't remember where that statistic came around, or 98% of the time. But gut feeling is wrong almost consistently because it's not based on data, and it's not systematic approach. Like you might look at a product line and another product line, you might have the feeling that that problem is more urgent than the other one, and I think that's where we end up consistently firefighting specific things that are appearing in the news, because our perception of that dangerousness is much higher than something else that might get breached, and that's why we continue seeing breaches, because maybe we prioritize the wrong element, because our perception of what's hot might be not what's going to actually hurt us.
And let me jump in real quick on that one. It's not even just what's hot. It's like what's hot for me, right? Because part of the risk work is you have data internally that describes your business. You can model the behavior that already exists within your business to get an idea of how you already operate, and then potentially use it as a parallel to what's actually happening with vulnerability data or industry data.
Mm-hmm.
So then at least you have an idea of with regards to like what's my appetite versus what I'm tolerant about, and do I need to change the business's behavior in doing so? Because what's hot for someone else may be cold for you. Like okay,
Right.
that we understand our environment, we have controls and monitoring in a place that what that's over there, we have a level of confidence, and we know our uncertainty, our gaps, that's not hotness for us. Maybe hot for you, but for us it's not. Being able to articulate that clearly, to me, I think there's a value in that for the business. Once again, my risk portfolio and the options that I have across that becomes extremely clear from a leader to know where I can invest more resources, where I can make better partnerships to enable the business, and how can I do that while managing the risk and allowing the business to I guess flex their risk in a way that makes sense and that doesn't essentially is not catastrophic.
I like that, because you're talking about business language right now that translate directly into engineering element, but also on that other aspect. I think you mentioned one thing that is like what's hot for you might not be hot for me. So it's about context, but it's about also the speed that organization want to operate on and want to go at. Like some organization might be at a risk level that is super high because they don't have anything to lose and they have everything to gain to actually go fast, and certain have so much to lose that their perception and tolerance is different, as well as being targeted by different threat actors. So a public organization or a publicly traded organization that have a lot of customer that are connected to them, they have a specific value, might be more at risk and targeted than another one by a specific threat actor group. But in general, right now, we're seeing as well the fact that a lot of these things get automated. So the argument of being small doesn't apply anymore to business, but it's rather who you are and what is the time to reaction that your business requires, or the level of risk tolerance. And in that, I think you had a perfect analogy that was how fast an engineering team want to go. And as a GRC and as a business, you can say, this is kind of the guardrail and this is kind of the speed suggestion that we can give, but then just feel free to test out the ground, right?
Yeah, there's something about like I used to watch a lot of rally racing back in the day, and I love the Subaru WRX. and there's I don't know, maybe it's a
Insane.
co-pilot in the car, and they get turn left 100, like they're projecting what should happen, and the driver can truly focus on like, how do I optimize for the corner that's coming up in 100 feet at X miles per hour. And I believe that like what GRC engineering can do and can facilitate is putting up those signposts, being that, hey, turn left 50 meters ahead, 60 miles per hour. It can be that signpost that says, hey, you can take this turn at 75 miles per hour on dry conditions. If wet, reduce to 55 miles per hour. If new slick tires, like we can provide that guidance. So really all you're focusing on is pure execution with speed. Like we want you to move as fast as possible, but without, in addition to minimizing the chances of catastrophic failure. Like failure will happen, but we don't want it to be to the point where it actually takes us out or puts us in a position where we're not resilient. And I think that ties into your other component. Like if we tie in the governance of how we behave to the resilience nature of the business, we can go as fast as we want to get to that red line and then figure out how resilient or how tolerant we are in terms of absorbing what could happen. But without that, there are opportunities where you're probably going to go over the cliff, and that can be catastrophic. I don't want you to go over the cliff. I want you to take the turn appropriately with the right speed, with the right tires, the right setup, and you just focus on getting the most you can out of that vehicle.
And I really like that, because is a collaboration to enable the business to go as fast as it possibly can with the level of structure that it has at that particular point in time, and maybe pushing, like knowing where your limits are and where your edge is. You might be able to push it a little bit, maybe bump the car, but not completely kill the car or total and crash the car. If you don't have that information, that in that particular condition, in that particular cliff, in that particular environment, you're never going to be able to survive, or you're very likely to get into a catastrophic accident, because the chances are you will be overly confident more than underly confident to actually take the turn.
Yep.
And I think that's what we're seeing. I think that's what we're seeing consistent in the market.
Yeah, to your point, I think that like as you're setting up new business lines, we can be overconfident to your point, and not saying we shouldn't like push the effort, but it's like, how do you minimize the catastrophic nature? I'm not saying we shouldn't try to push the limits. It's okay if we push the limits and we roll over, how fast do we even get back up? That's part of, to me, the tolerance and the resilient nature of the business. And like, we're just not talking about the risk, but we're also talking about the opportunity costs and rewards and what we can do to be more resilient in face of the risk. I think that's another area as a risk management professional, is just not talking about like the worst outcomes. It's okay, the worst outcomes plus our ability to slingshot back and get back on track. It's a cohesive equation. And I think right now we've been focusing more on like the risk GRC component, but there's also the resilient component that allows for true understanding of what is my capacity to respond and react, have that assurance of the capabilities that exist within the business, within our investments across security engineering, to enable, once again, the true business outcome and deliverables.
I like that, because I think that's the other aspect, the recovery from something, and the recovery even from a catastrophic thing. I don't think it can be postponed anymore, because we will fail. Like as business, we will end up failing all the time, and sometimes even catastrophic. I think we've seen of recently several aspects where that has been taken, without mentioning names and name, where that failure has led to a disastrous outcome, versus certain organizations that have been transparent and reacting fast and alerting fast. So that level of element has teached a lesson even afterwards, and teach other people a lesson. I think that's what we should do more and more as a community. And we have enough element to actually say, okay, if we had these controls, if we have this focus on risk, operating at risk, maybe we were overly confident on the risk level. Maybe that's something, it can help us. I wanted to ask, well, we are almost at the time, so I want to ask the
Mhm.
folk to put forward questions. I think we have a couple of people that have said hi. Um, what was your opinion on the whole Log4j, or kind of the knee-jerk reaction on the top headline vulnerabilities versus operating a little bit with more risk awareness? Have you seen, from your perspective and from organizational and other organizational perspective, have you seen a knee-jerk reaction there, or?
I would say I'm not sure, and I think you have insight to a lot of the data, and we've talked about this. I think I'll go back to the phrase, "What's hot for you might not be hot for me," but because of the nature of what it was, Log4j, like everybody was in on it, like everyone was responding in a way. It would have been interesting to see, and knowing that there was active scanning and exploitation of this was probably another indicator around this. It would be interesting to see how organizations internally worked on what were the most important things to fix, like their ability to classify which assets had it, and their ability to actually understand that, and then the mechanisms for which they could actually fix or resolve or remediate. Like, what were their risk and treatment options that were available, and how much burnout did that actually cause for the individuals, not just on the security team, but also on all the partner teams that were probably involved. So once again, there's like a people component, there's the technology component of this, and then the process component of making it all work together. So it's not just engineering sake just to do engineering, but once again, it's all the systems that go together and really understanding how they're governed and how they're supposed to operate to actually drive an outcome for security for the business.
Yeah, it's the ripple effect as well that had.
Exactly.
And from my view and perspective, I think I've seen a knee-jerk reaction across the board of like, that's the headline things. It's going to be critical. It's going to be catastrophic. I've seen it happening with 3 or 4 other aspects.
Mhm.
So I'm on a mission to actually demystify a lot of this catastrophic, or to say actually this is really bad. Like the new recent thing about Cisco is really bad. But then we had, like, again, I've seen there where organization have been, like, third party organization have been calling other people and saying there is an opportunity. Trash your Cisco device, buy a new one because that's the only way to make it secure.
It's an
So I
extreme
guess there is
option.
a risk reward. There is a risk reward opportunity. There is a lot of unknown, unfortunately, around those kind of problems and risk. And there is completely the absence of asset inventory, asset management. So the thing that I've seen consistently is, oh my God, how much is it going to hurt us? How exposed are we? Like, we should have learned from strats to actually do proper inventory. And right now we have, like, I can understand from a network perspective, from traditional building up, when you had the repo sitting somewhere else, when you had your server sitting somewhere else, that's really hard to do inventory. But right now we have cloud system, we have system like us that can do that stuff in an automated way. I don't think nowadays there is any excuse not to know what you're operating. And I think what CISA in the US has done, in a little bit on regulation, is pushing organization to understand a little bit more their asset inventory and software asset inventory and the supply chain, because those things can help
Yeah.
get a little bit more context. And I've seen 2 or 3 organizations that says, well, this bunch of servers are actually not exposed, so let's forget about those. But we have 5 systems that actually are critical for our business that are actually exposed. So let's focus on patching those ASAP. But that means that these 5 systems, not 500 systems, so you don't need to keep the entire security team wake up over the weekends, every weekend, to actually patch those systems, because then you have SLAs and contractual element that you need to agree with organization.
Yeah, and lastly, as we wrap up, I'll say, even with those 5 that you identified, I wonder I wonder what's the process for cataloging the systems that you don't, because there's also this whole concept of the residual risk for which a business maintains and carries increases over time, and how do you then prioritize that work in relation to keeping the lights on work versus new opportunity trade-offs. there's also, I think, an interesting conversation around the inflection point of how those two things come together. Because those other servers at some point still need to be patched if you have other risks that allow for internal. But what is that? But it gives you an opportunity to have a different type of conversation versus we need to do all the things now
at once. Yeah, I think it's a time element, because, as I like to say, vulnerability management is a muscle. But as we get closer, as we get to the close, where can people find more about you, Charles, and these forward-looking thinking prospects?
Well, please look me up on LinkedIn, Charles Nwatu, NWATU. I'm always open to have a conversation. There's great conversations happening online. This gentleman here, he's great. I highly recommend, and there's a lot of others of us online, so please reach out. So I definitely was excited to just share my ideas and thoughts on this conversation today, and hopefully spur some other conversations with folks in the industry about this.
Brilliant. And I'm really looking forward for our next follow-up, where we're going to analyze the next critical things. And we said, well, I think we learned. I'll be gladly surprised to say, actually, we learned that lesson. We're actually doing asset management. We're actually doing these things right. But anyway, Charles, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and your smile and your analogies that I love so much, and I'm going to reuse all the time.
Thank you, Francesco. I hope you have a wonderful day, my man.
Brilliant. And everybody else, go and try your GRC approach to business, because it can be surprising what you can get out of it.
Yeah, let me know how it goes too.
Put in the comment it works, or actually it was a dramatic failure. And let's see who scores best in the risk score. Brilliant. Stay safe out there. Thank you, Charles.